Welcome, everyone. So we left off in the book of Daniel, and we were just getting really into chapter 5, and we're going to continue in chapter 5 today. If you'll take your Bible and turn to Daniel chapter 5, we're going to pick up pretty much where we left off last time. So turn to chapter 5 and verse 1. We're at the time now where it's almost the end of the captivity, almost the end of the 70 years. We are going to pick up where it's 68 years in, so they got 2 years left, 68 years since the captivity began. And then soon Babylon will be overthrown by Darius the Mede, and he comes to power. And then through Cyrus, the Jews are set free. That's the next big thing, and they're free to go back, rebuild the city, and then rebuild the temple. And that's what this is about. At any rate, where we are right now is a character which I'm sure you know well, Belshazzar, and this is where we kind of left off last time. He was co-regent of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar was gone, and the primary king, who was Nabonidus, and he was away. Belshazzar, who many think is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, was co-regent. So he was sort of the king when the king was absent. The king was out on military conquest, so Belshazzar was now sort of like the teenager at home who was acting like a king. His daddy said don't have parties, but as you probably know. So Belshazzar now is sort of the teenage kid who's acting like a king, a brat, basically. And he's going to have a party, which is where we're going to pick up. Daniel chapter 5 and verse 1. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and the silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father or grandfather, had taken from the temple. Now that's key to remember. These are the things that Nebuchadnezzar sacked from the temple when he took the temple down, just before he destroyed it. He went in there twice, and he took all the articles, and then he destroyed the temple. So these are the holy items, the holy implements from the temple that were now in Belshazzar's hands. And so he took them from the temple in Jerusalem so that the king, Belshazzar, and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So they're going to now just dirty these and sully these implements. Verse 3 of chapter 5. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. I can just see God getting a little annoyed at this, waiting and watching. And he's going to respond in a few moments here, we're going to see. Verse 4, as they drank the wine, using the instruments of the temple of God, the true God, they praised the gods of gold and of silver and of bronze. This is bad, of iron, wood, and stone. God is going to have to respond to him, and he will in a moment. Let's see if we can draw any parallels to this, using the Babylonian party that we just talked about, with the holy vessels being used in a disgusting manner to worship other gods, sort of in your face to the true God. Can we draw any parallels and define a little more about God's holy character? Well, this is the culmination scene at the total decadence of Babylon. And this is what this is. Babylon was totally decadent. And now we see Belshazzar, who is the king of decadence here, showing his decadence and in the face of God. Sort of like where we are today, if you think about how our government runs and even the world. But if you look at where we are today, we are now at the point of not just being decadent and worshiping other gods, but now we're shaking our fist at the true God. And so it usually works out this way with the heathen. Let's turn to 2 Chronicles. Let's look at what happened as a summary of it in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verses 17 and 18. Now here Ezra is talking about the story from that standpoint. So it's 2 Chronicles 36, 17 and 18. He brought up against them the king of the Babylonians, who killed their young men with the sword in the sanctuary, and spared neither young man nor young woman, old man or age. This is the story of the capture of the temple. God handed all of them over to Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 18, he carried to Babylon, and this is the point, when he sacked the temple and he did all those things, which God allowed him to do, he carried to Babylon all the articles from the temple of God, both large and small, and the treasures of the Lord's temple and the treasures of the king and his officials. So that's the backstory. That's what Nebuchadnezzar did. So now this is what Belshazzar is doing with these things. Let's go back to chapter 5 of Daniel and verse 5. And this is where you knew it was going, because you know the Bible pretty well enough anyway. Most people do know the story, the handwriting on the wall. Daniel chapter 5, verse 5. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. And the Amplified Bible puts it this way: immediately and suddenly, there appeared the fingers of a man's hand and wrote on the plaster of the wall opposite the candlestick, so exposed especially to the light. Now remember, the candlestick is something very interesting. You've probably already guessed what that is. It's the menorah. The menorah, which was stolen from the temple, which they had lit. And so the hand is writing on the wall by the lampstand, which is giving the light in the king's palace. I want to just emphasize what the menorah means. And you may understand some of this because you've heard of the menorah, you've studied the Bible before. This is the import of the menorah. So I'm going to read to you the menorah and its detail just quickly from Exodus 25, verses 31 to 40. When God is giving Moses the instructions to build this special lampstand, which is a key feature throughout God's whole plan, even until today. Because I have mentioned in the past that the 7 candles of the menorah, first of all, the center candle is the highest, and it's called the Shamash, which points to Jesus Christ. The other 6 are pointed to him. And the way that the menorah was maintained was that the servant, it's called the servant lamp, would be used to light the others as they were maintained and re-oiled and so forth, and the wicks changed. But also, if you look at the 7 holy days, and I've discussed this before, and I don't know if I say it here again in the notes. I don't think so. I think it's back when we did the study in the book of Exodus. We covered the menorah and its importance. The way the menorah is laid out, the 7 holy days are also laid out in the menorah the way it stands. So it's a very important piece of temple equipment, as it were. So I'm just going to read and just a little bit of the detail. And when God gives detail for something, you know there's a very good reason for it. It says here, make a lampstand of pure gold and hammer it out, base and shaft. Its flower-like cups, buds, and blossoms shall be of one piece with it. 6 branches are to extend from the sides. We know the 6 come up from the sides. 3 on one side and 3 on the other. 3 cups shaped like almond flowers, and buds and blossoms are to be on one branch and the next branch, and the same for all 6 branches from the lampstand. And on the lampstand, there are to be 4 cups shaped like almond flowers. So it goes into this great detail. And then it says here, the buds and the branches shall all be of one piece with the lampstand, hammered out of pure gold. In Exodus 25:37, then make it 7 lamps and set them up on it, so that they light the space in front of it. Now remember, light the space in front of it. In Nebuchadnezzar's palace, now the space in front of the lamp is being lit, and that's where that wall pretty much is. And it goes on about its wick trimmers and so forth. And it says here, I just want to emphasize this before we go back to Daniel chapter 5. It says here in Exodus 25, verse 40, after all those detailed instructions to create the menorah, it says, see that you make them according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. This is where Moses received the law. He received all the instructions for the tabernacle and the menorah as well, which it fit into the tabernacle and in the temple. Let's go back to Daniel. Now we're talking about this handwriting on the wall near this peculiar lampstand here. The king watched the hand as it wrote in verse 6 of chapter 5. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together. Now, have you ever been that frightened? I don't know if I've ever been that frightened, but I've been pretty close, and I can understand what that is. Knees knocking, and his legs gave way. So I guess he fell. The king called out for the enchanters, the astrologers, the diviners, called for everybody. Somebody's got to have an answer to this now. To be brought and said to these wise men of Babylon. Sounds familiar. Didn't Nebuchadnezzar go through something like this with some dreams? And he said to them, whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom. All the king's wise men came in. They all think they're going to get this purple coat. They came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. Again, it's the same problem that they had when Nebuchadnezzar called the wise men in, because he said, not only interpret the dream, but he was wise enough to say, tell me what the dream was. Whoa, wait, king, you never told us to do that before. We can interpret a dream because they can obviously say whatever they want. But when he said that you have to tell me what I dreamed, that was something they could not fake. Verse 9, so King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. And that's after his legs went out from under him. His nobles were baffled. Chapter 5, verse 10. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall and said, "O king, live forever." And she says, "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale." It's like, well, the queen has something she's going to do to help the situation here. And she says, there is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, the king, I say, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. So remember, he knew this. He remembers this. I don't know, well, he should have been born by then, but at any rate, he knows the story, and now she's revisiting to him. Oh, remember this guy Daniel who did these things, and he was the head of the astrologers, so you might as well try to go get him. That's what they did. Verse 12, this man Daniel, whom the king called Belshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams and explain riddles, and so he goes. So verse 13, Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah?" I guess maybe he never met him or never saw him, because he says, "I have heard that the spirit of the gods are in you," but he heard the story probably. "And you have insight, intelligence, and understanding wisdom." Verse 16, "Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing on the wall and tell me what it means," then he's going to give Daniel the purple clothing and the gold chain, and he's going to make him the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Daniel's already been there once. So in verse 17, look what Daniel says to him. Daniel answers the king, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else." That's treading on pretty hard territory to say, keep it for yourself. I don't even want your gifts. But I will read the handwriting on the wall for the king and tell him what it means. And he says, "O king, the most high God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the peoples and nations and men of every language dreaded and feared him." Now, Belshazzar knows these things. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. You remember that story. We talked about that in the last Bible study. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and set over them anyone he wishes. And remember that chapter 4 was written by Nebuchadnezzar in Aramaic. That's amazing. Now, Daniel, after he prefaces this with Belshazzar, he says, "But you, his son, Belshazzar, you have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this." He knew it. "Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblet from his temple brought to you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways." And that's something that we all got to remember. Thankfully, we who are Christian and truly saved, we know that that's a good thing. But if anybody's not truly saved in Christ, this applies to you too, but it's not going to wind up very good for you. And there's no way around it, just like for him. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. Now, here's where we go into the inscription. And the inscription was written in verse 25, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin or Upharsin, however you want to pronounce it. It was written in Aramaic, and they knew Aramaic. Why wasn't anybody able to interpret it? Think about it. And I have an example here, which I used when I first taught this. I want you to think of how God set this up. He didn't write it in a strange language, and he didn't write it in a coded language, but he wrote it in a code, and here's how he did it. It was really more like a metaphor. Here's an example that I had found when I was doing the study. So imagine, if you will, Adam and Eve. Now they are going to sin, or let's say they've already sinned, they've taken the fruit, and somewhere on wherever they're standing and on some wall somewhere, all of a sudden it comes up in their native language, which I'm pretty sure was Hebrew. But if it was English, it would say, all of a sudden they see a hand writing these words: tree, tree, fruit, conscience, band. Just think of this: tree, tree, fruit, conscience, band. Now, it's in the language you understand, but it's a code. How do you figure this out? Well, let's look at what it might mean. And as we look at what many tekel uparsin would mean, and we're going to obviously go into that. Tree would be the tree of life. That's the first tree. The second tree would be the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So we know that this is talking about the two objects that were set before Adam and Eve and the ones that they had to deal with, and they chose what they wanted to do. Then it says fruit, tree, tree, fruit. So the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which you, Adam and Eve, were not to eat, but with which you ate. You have two trees in the garden, and you were told of one tree you cannot eat the fruit. But when you did, your conscience was pricked, or you had a conscience, your eyes were opened, and you will acknowledge your guilt and sin. And they did. Remember, they saw that they were naked all of a sudden, and they covered themselves, so they had conscience. And finally, after all of that, on this road of what they did, and the result was that they were banned. You will be thrust outside and locked out of paradise. So if you look at that code, it gave the whole story of what had happened and what God's disposition of the matter was going to be. Well, we can use that same idea and decode what was said here. The interpretation that God gave Daniel for this, if we go to chapter 5, verses 25 and 28, it's that same, but in the Amplified Bible, it actually spells it out. And I don't know if other versions actually spell it out in English. It says here, numbered, weighed, divisions. So remember, tree, tree, fruit, conscience, band. Now we have numbered, weighed, divisions. Let's read what the Bible says is the interpretation. Verse 26, this is what the words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. So that's good. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So it must be Uparsin, must be another translation of it. But anyway, you see how it flows, that the way we looked at the flow of the decision points for Adam and Eve, how they handled it in their free will, what they did when they realized and they were told or they knew that they had done wrong, and God's response, exactly the same thing here. We move down to chapter 5, verse 29. Then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple. A gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. And here's the end of the story. To him, Belshazzar. Verse 30. Daniel walks away with the purple and the gold and all that stuff, and that very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. And then it says here, and this is key, Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. The year for this was the year 538 BC. That's when this happened. But God was preparing for all of this before that. And so we see how God worked, where in the background, he's always preparing for something, right? He's always preparing on this thing called time, where whatever he's preparing is going to wind up at a convergence at just the right time. So what the Bible shows here, and what a lot of times I know I see in my life, and you probably see in your own lives, is that God will do some miracle or something for you or to you as either chastisement or a miracle or whatever. Let's say you need a job, and I've been laid off many times, and all of a sudden there'd be a job waiting for me, and it would be a little bit of a path to get there. But I would realize after I got it, look back and say, well, wait a minute, God had to orchestrate a lot of things with people that I don't even know, in situations I don't even know, to do this. I'm going to give you one example. This is a great example, because this actually is a perfect example of something that should never have happened when I needed a job. So I work for Dell right now, but I worked for Dell back in 2006. I had gotten laid off in 2005 from a company I was with, and they wanted me to come back. And I said, no, I wasn't going to go back to them for other reasons. They wanted me to take over more territory. It's like, no, I'm not coming back. You shouldn't have let me go in the first place. I'm not coming back. So I'm interviewing. I'm trying to find a job. Now, this is exactly what happened. Years before, I think about 3 or 4 years before, one of the other times I got laid off, I had applied to Dell, had some email trails with human resources, and I went for the first interview, and I didn't get the job. Didn't even go back for a second interview because they said I wasn't right at that time for that position, whatever. That's fine. Okay. But I had forgotten about all of that because I had worked since then. But the emails were still in the system. You see how God's orchestrating something because HR had my information. So this is what happened. This is the hand of God. Hand of God. I'm laid off and I'm looking for a job. All of a sudden, out of the blue, I haven't even applied to Dell again. I wasn't even thinking of Dell again. Out of the blue, I get an errant email from the recruiter, an internal recruiter from Dell that was sent to my email address, but telling this guy, Tom, congratulations on joining the team. You're being a systems engineer. Here's your start date. Here's the information you need. I'm saying, that's uncanny. How did that happen? My name's not even Tom. They couldn't even make a mistake, but she sent it to me. So I'm thinking I'm going to be nice about this, and I'm going to reply to her and saying, look, I'm not the person you think I am. I want to make sure you know that this email didn't get to the person you intended it to get to, but I am looking. So she says, great. Well, we'll see, She says, I'm very sorry. And that was the end of that email. So I wrote back later on. I said, no worries at all. But do you have any, I told her of my background. I sent her my resume again. All of a sudden, she says, oh, yeah, we're looking for a systems engineer in the Boston area, in New England territory, Northern New England territory. And they're interviewing next week in downtown Boston. And I'll set you up for the interview. This is inside of a week and a half. But I didn't even know about this. I get an errant email, which wasn't even intended for me. I reply twice. And she says, oh, yeah, I'll set you up for an interview. This is not the end of the story. The best part's coming. I go down. It was at a hotel downtown in Boston, right by the north end, right by the aquarium there. So I go to the hotel, and they had this big conference room that they rented, and they had the hiring managers there because they were trotting a lot of people through. I'm not going to get this job. Remember, I went there one time. I didn't get the job. I go for the interview. That was on Tuesday or Wednesday. I'm hopefully going to get. I thought the interview went well, but you never really know. So I'm hoping that I'm going to at least get invited for a second interview. This is what happened. I was out. I was actually working at the church at that time. I was helping construct the gymnasium. I got a call from my wife on that Friday, and she says, were you expecting a FedEx letter from Dell? I wasn't expecting anything at all, but hopefully an invitation to a second interview. I come home. I open it. It's an offer letter. They didn't even tell me they hired me. I get an offer letter. All the specifics, all the salary, everything. It was great. I took the job. All that to say, now look, that's a miracle. That's a miracle. From an errant email to I interview and I get a job, and the rest, as they say, is history. Now I'm working for Dell again, but this is a different thing. God sets all of this stuff up in the background to converge at just the right time. And if you look at the way this happened for me, he was setting this stuff up from years ago to even have me go in there to give them my email address, and they had my information so they could accidentally send me an email. And then when I pursued it from them, all of a sudden I get a job out of it. Amazing. This is the thing about the God we serve. So we see here how it was all set up. You could see that, yes, when he said to Belshazzar, and Daniel said to Belshazzar, look, your life and your times are in God's hand. David said that in the Psalms. Teach us to number our days. No matter what, my life and my times are in your hands. And I look at my life, and I know you look at yours, but I mean, to give each other these examples, these testimonies, we must have a lot of these examples, or at least a few of them. And I have more than that one. And I know that's why I can trust my God, and I can live in comfort knowing that my God is already got everything sewed up, my life and my time. Every hair on my head, and I'm losing it, you can see. They're in his hands. Okay. So having said that, let's talk about this a little bit. The year was 538 BC that this happened with Belshazzar, and he died. And it says Darius the Mede, and if you look at the statue, Nebuchadnezzar's statue, that's the next empire to take over, right? The Medes and the Persians. But God was preparing the siege for quite a while. You know when he started doing that? About 22 years before. How do we know that? Because I have a nice book here with some history that we're going to go over in a second, because I want you to see how this works out. It's really amazing to me. First of all, with the beginning of the reign of Cyrus, now we know what Cyrus did. Cyrus was the one who actually had the order to release the Jews, because God named him a couple of hundred years before he was even born by name in the book of Isaiah. I think you know the story. I know we discussed that in former Bible studies. But think of this. This is 22 years in the making. It's like sort of that errant email. It's like that was 22 years before he had to get the email. You know what I'm saying? So listen to this. First of all, how did he do it? Babylon was well fortified because, look, you're a kingdom and you're the most powerful kingdom on the earth. You're going to have walls. You're going to have an army. You're going to be defending yourself because everybody's going to want to either break in to get out after you conquer them, right? History holds that the walls that surrounded Babylon were the girth of 4 chariots wide. It was sort of like the Great Wall in China, but it was larger. And they used to actually run chariots on the wall for the outlook, for the overlook, to protect the city and to be, the overseers there. How do you break through? How do you do that? Well, let's review the handwriting on the wall account briefly from what Josephus said about it. And we're going to talk about how he got through here. Josephus said, Mene, that if it be expounded in the Greek language may signify a number, because God has numbered so long a time for your life and your government, like he's numbered for all of us, our lives and whatever we're doing, yet that remains but a small portion. Teke means a weight, and God has weighed in the balance and finds it going down already. This is what Josephus said. Perez, or Upharsin, this also in the Greek tongue denotes a fragment. God will therefore break your kingdom and divide it among the Medes and the Persians. And we know that Nebuchadnezzar's statue had already shown that. And that would be that. The handwriting on the wall, and that's it. I'm going to read you. Remember that we have the Babylonian captivity was 70 years. What you have to remember, you have to factor in that they did not work off of a 365-day year. They worked off of a 360-day prophetic year from the lunar calendar. So everything that's calculated in the scriptures that's prophetic is always based on a 360-day year. Having said that, we're not going to get into the big calculations here. But that very night, Belshazzar was slain and Darius the Mede took over at the age of 62. Remember, this started 22 years before that. It says that basically God was prepared a worm. Remember that word, a worm. Worms eat through things, right? Let's think of that. To enter Babylon at just the right time. And I'm going to read you something very interesting. This book, some of you who are in here would have probably seen this book because I've used it before. It's called The Annals of the World. I'm going to read this for you and we'll stop here tonight. But it's called The Annals of the World. Now, this is an interesting book. This book was written by a man named James Bishop Usher. It chronicles all of the world's major events from actually the beginning, from Adam and Eve. Let's look at this here. In 560 BC, remember it was 538 BC when this had happened, so preparing beforehand, 560 BC. It says here, in the kingdom of Media, when Ahasuerus died, he was succeeded by his son, Cyrus's mother's brother. That's Cyrus's mother's brother. This was in the beginning of the first year of the 55th Olympiad, 31 years before the death of Cyrus. But this is only 22 years before that. Daniel called Cyrus Darius the Mede, the son of Ahasuerus. So Darius the Mede is the son of Ahasuerus. But here we go. In 559 BC, moving forward in time, the king of Babylon conscripted troops from his own subjects and sought the help of Croesus, the king of Lydia, together with the kings of Cappadocia and some other places to the west. And they go through that, but this was to join with him in battle against the Medes and the Persians. He told them that they were 2 great nations who were now allied together. Medes and the Persians, now they were allied together. What did Nebuchadnezzar's statue said was already going to happen? This is already happening 22 years before. He told them that they were 2 great nations who were allied together. If they were not checked, they would eventually overrun and bring into subjection all countries near and far. Now, Cyrus, at that time in 559 BC, was made general of the Persian army. Sounds like that statue's coming to life. By his father Cambyses and all of the council of the kingdom. He was sent to Media with 30,000 soldiers and 1,000 commanders, all of equal authority under his command. When he came, he was made general of the Median forces by his uncle Cyrus, who had sent for him and was placed solely in charge of the war against the Babylonians. So this was already in force. This was already in play. This is 21 years before it says here in the scriptures, Belshazzar dies and Darius the Mede is there. Isn't that amazing? The 30 years of Cyrus's reign started from this time, and it goes on a little bit longer, and there's some more here. Here's the invasion of Babylon. Listen to this. The next year, this is 539 BC still. The next year, Cyrus marched to Babylon. Here, Cyrus defeated Belshazzar. What did the scriptures just say? The Chaldeans retreated into the city and resolved to endure the siege, which they took lightly for two reasons. Listen to this. First, they had more than 20 years of provisions in Babylon, so they could be under siege for 22 years and it didn't matter, or over 20 years. Secondly, they thought that there were many in Cyrus's army who favored the Chaldeans and more than the Persians. And now here's how they did this. Cyrus made a vast trench around the wall of the city, that wall that was 4 chariots wide. Cyrus breached the city. He cast up the earth toward his own army and made bulwarks along the walls. He placed guards along these and divided the whole army into 12 parts. He ordered that each part should in turn stand watch for a month. When Cyrus had spent much time in this work with little to show for it, remember, this is ramping up to Belshazzar being dead, right, and the invasion, he finally made a ditch from the river to that vast lake about 40 or 50 miles wide, which Belshazzar's mother, Nicotrus, had ordered to be dug. Then he opened the mouths of this and other various ditches, which he had recently built around the city. This is all around that big wall. This took time to do. And let the river flow into them. In this way, he made the channel, which was not more than 400 yards wide, passable for his men to enter into the city. Finally, Cyrus with his army went through the water gates and into the wall and got into the city on a festival day, Belshazzar's festival day, while all the men were banqueting. That banquet, when they got the handwriting on the wall. So vast was that city, as the inhabitants reported, when the people on its outskirts were surprised and taken by the enemy, those who lived in the heart of the city never even heard it. Jeremiah alluded to this when he said, "Post upon post and messenger upon messenger shall run to tell the king of Babylon that all the outskirts of the city were possessed by the enemies." That's Jeremiah 51, verse 31. So let's close with this idea. I just read you what the Bible basically said in like a sentence. I read you, that very night, Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over. Cyrus was there, over the kingdom at the age of 62. Now think of that. I just read you the years of getting around and building the siege works of the wall, which wasn't working right. Then he got the idea of building these channels. And finally, he gets the army in there, but the city was so big that even after he invaded on the night of that big party, most people didn't even know about it until they were already in their houses conquering them. See how God works? So we're going to wrap it up right there. I hope you enjoyed that little bit of history. The archaeology is really starting to show a lot of the history of how it worked out. But these books can tell us also the same thing, because the archaeologists may or may not know. Obviously, they know this, but when you look at the Bible and you realize the massive control that God has over all history and all people, and it takes years sometime to get to the point of convergence, just think about prophecy and where we are today. If you think about what everybody's talking about, and everybody knows Israel's back in the land, we have all of these things happening, they took Jerusalem back in 1967, and you do the math, how the years worked out and all these things, it just didn't happen. This has been a plan since before the beginning of time, which God says everything, He knows the end from the beginning. I just wanted to bring that to you because most of you, if not all of you, know this story. But to consider the import of how God made it all work out for that one night of convergence. And then we're going to get into chapter 6 next time, which starts going through the rest of us and how the Jews start getting ready to go back in the rest of Daniel. Good. And that'll be it. Good night.